The hum of the clock filled the quiet room, its steady rhythm echoing the march of time that I had come to know all too well. I stared out the window, the snow settling gently on the ground outside, each flake shimmering in the faint glow of the streetlights. Life had grown slower in the 2 years since Stella had passed, but it wasn't less demanding. "Alice," I called softly, not wanting to disturb her if she was still asleep. No reply came, and I knew she was likely lost in one of her books, the same way her mother had once been. Alice had been a part of my world for 16 years, ever since my son and his wife left her at our doorstep. They had dreams too big for the small town we lived in, ambitions that couldn't include a toddler. Stella and I had stepped in without hesitation, though raising a child again wasn't a path we'd imagined. When Alice was small, she was a whirlwind of questions and laughter. Stella had a way of grounding her, telling her the stories of our youth, making pancakes in the shape of stars, or brushing her hair in front of the mirror while humming old lullabies. I was the disciplinarian, the one who enforced rules and made sure she never strayed too far. That balance had crumbled the night Stella didn't wake up. It was a stroke, the doctor said, sudden and unforgiving. Alice clung to me in the aftermath, her sobs shaking against my chest as we stood by the graveside. It was then that I realized my granddaughter wasn't just grieving her grandmother. She was looking to me, the only family she had left, to be everything. "Gramps," her voice came, soft and tentative, pulling me from my thoughts. I turned to see her standing at the door, wrapped in the oversized sweater Stella used to wear. Her brown hair framed her face, wisps curling around her cheeks. Her eyes, Stella's eyes, held a mix of affection and something I couldn't quite place. "Didn't hear you come down," I said, my voice catching slightly. "I was reading," she replied, a faint smile touching her lips. "Thought I'd see if you needed anything. You're the one who does all the taking care of around here," I teased gently, though my words carried the weight of truth. Alice had stepped into Stella's shoes in more ways than I was comfortable admitting. She cooked our meals, managed the shopping, and somehow still excelled at school. She seemed older than her 18 years, her maturity forged by the kind of life no child should have to endure. "You make it easy, Gramps," she said, crossing the room to sit beside me on the couch. I watched her closely, searching for signs of the child she used to be, the one who'd beg me to push her on the swing or help her build forts in the living room. But she wasn't a child anymore. She was a young woman, and the realization struck me with a pang I couldn't quite name. "How's that essay coming along?" I asked, shifting the conversation to safer ground. "It's fine," she replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "But I was thinking about taking a break tomorrow. Maybe we could go to the lake." Her suggestion caught me off guard. We hadn't been to the lake since before Stella's passing, back when our little family outings felt effortless. "Sure," I said finally. "It'd be good to get out of the house." Her face lit up, and for a moment, I saw the girl she'd been, her excitement unguarded and pure. The lake was just as I remembered it, calm, endless, and surrounded by the sprawling oaks whose reflections danced on its surface. It had been years since I last stood there, and yet the place felt timeless, like it had been waiting for us to return. Alice skipped ahead, her laughter mingling with the crunch of leaves beneath her boots. For a moment, it felt as if the weight of the years had lifted, and we were just two people enjoying a crisp winter day. "Still as beautiful as ever," she said, stopping at the edge of the water. I wasn't sure if she meant the lake or something else entirely. She turned to me, her green eyes bright and filled with something I hadn't seen in her before, a calmness, a quiet sort of joy. "Why don't we come here more often, Gramps?" she asked, brushing her blonde hair out of her face as the wind caught it. I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. "It reminded me too much of your grandmother," I admitted finally. Her smile faltered, just a little. "I miss her, too," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of all the things she didn't say. We stood in silence for a while, the sound of the water lapping against the shore filling the spaces between us. The grief felt lighter here, surrounded by the familiar and the natural. "Do you ever feel lonely?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely audible. Her question caught me off guard. "Sometimes," I said, "but having you around makes it easier." She turned to me, her gaze steady. "You've always been there for me, Gramps. I don't know what I'd do without you." The words hit me harder than they should have. They weren't new. Alice had always been expressive about her gratitude, but something about the way she said them now felt different. She wasn't just a girl seeking comfort from her guardian. She was a woman confiding in someone she trusted. "You don't have to think about that," I said, my voice gruff as I tried to push away the strange feeling rising in my chest. We stayed at the lake until the sun dipped low, casting the world in shades of gold and amber. On the way home, Alice hummed a song I didn't recognize, her voice soft and melodic. Back at the house, Alice retreated to her room while I busied myself in the kitchen, trying to ignore the growing restlessness I felt. She'd been spending more time at home recently, especially since starting university. I'd assumed she'd make friends easily. Someone as bright and kind as Alice should have been surrounded by people who appreciated her. But she wasn't. "It's not that I don't like them," she'd explained once, when I asked why she didn't go out more. "I just don't feel close to them. Not the way I do with you." At the time, I dismissed it as her adjusting to a new chapter in her life. Now, though, I wondered if it was something more. That evening, as I sat in my armchair, Alice came downstairs, her hair pulled back and her face scrubbed clean of makeup. She wore a soft sweater and leggings, and I couldn't help but notice how much she resembled her grandmother at that age. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, motioning to the couch. "Of course not," I replied, setting aside my book. She curled up at the other end, tucking her legs beneath her. "Remember when we used to watch old movies together? You'd always fall asleep halfway through, and I'd have to wake you up before the credits rolled." I chuckled. "I remember you stealing all the popcorn before the first act was over." Her laugh was light, but her expression grew serious. "I miss those days," she said, "when everything felt simple." I looked at her, unsure of how to respond. "Things change," I said finally, "but that doesn't mean they can't still be good." Her gaze lingered on me, and for a moment, it felt like she wanted to say something more. But she didn't. Instead, she reached for the remote and turned on the TV, settling into the cushions. As the hours passed, I found myself growing more aware of her presence. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the way her green eyes caught the flicker of the screen, the way she leaned ever so slightly toward me as she got comfortable. When the credits finally rolled, she didn't move. "Thanks for today," she said softly. "For what?" "For being you." She smiled, and it felt like the room grew warmer, like the spaces between us weren't as wide as they had been before. The days that followed were quiet, but something unspoken lingered in the air. Alice seemed closer than ever, her laughter filling the house as she recounted stories from her classes or shared random thoughts that crossed her mind. Yet, late at night, when the house was still, I often found myself lying awake, my thoughts wandering to her. I told myself it was just the emptiness left by Stella, the silence that Alice had so effortlessly filled. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The kitchen was warm and filled with the aroma of garlic and herbs. Alice stood beside me at the counter, her hands deftly chopping vegetables while I worked on the sauce. A bottle of wine sat open between us, its rich scent mingling with the other smells of dinner. "Are you sure this isn't too much garlic?" she asked, glancing at me with a teasing smile. "Too much garlic? Impossible," I said with mock indignation. "That's the secret to staying young." She laughed, the sound light and easy. "Well, if you say so, Gramps." I poured us each a glass of wine, the red liquid catching the light as it filled the glasses. Alice took hers with a soft thank you, her fingers brushing mine for a fleeting moment. It was such a small gesture, yet it sent a ripple through me that I couldn't quite explain. "Tell me another story," she said suddenly, leaning against the counter as she sipped her wine. "Another one? Haven't I told you all of them by now?" She shook her head, her blonde hair catching the light. "Not even close. What about your college years? You've been awfully quiet about those." I chuckled, taking a sip of my wine. "There's not much to tell. Just a lot of studying and trying to figure out life." "Come on," she pressed, her green eyes sparkling with curiosity. "You must have had your fair share of admirers." Her words caught me off guard, but I played along. "Well, there might have been a few," I admitted, a sheepish grin spreading across my face. "But nothing serious. I wasn't a settling down type back then." Alice tilted her head. "Studying me. I can see that. You've always had this confidence about you, like you know exactly who you are." I felt my cheeks flush, and I turned back to the stove to hide it. "That's just age, Alice. You learn a lot about yourself when you've been around as long as I have." She stepped closer, her presence warm and steady beside me. "It's not just that," she said softly. "You're different. You make people feel safe, like they can trust you." Her words lingered in the air, heavier than I expected. I glanced at her, and for a moment, the world outside the kitchen faded away. "I hope you know you can trust me too," I said finally, my voice quiet but firm. Her gaze softened, and she reached out to touch my arm. "I do, Gramps. More than anyone." Dinner was a quiet affair, the kind of comfortable silence that spoke of years spent in each other's company. Alice kept the conversation light, occasionally teasing me about my cooking skills or lack thereof. But there was an intimacy to the moment that neither of us could ignore. Afterward, as we cleaned up, Alice brushed against me more than once, her touch lingering just a little longer than necessary. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it left me feeling restless. When the dishes were done, she poured us each another glass of wine and led me to the living room. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. Alice curled up on the couch beside me, her legs tucked beneath her. "You never told me what made you fall for Grandma," she said suddenly, her voice thoughtful. I leaned back, swirling the wine in my glass as I considered her question. "She was different," I said finally. "She had this way of seeing the world, like everything was a story waiting to be told. And she didn't put up with any of my nonsense." Alice smiled. "She sounds amazing." "She was," I said softly, my thoughts drifting back to the years we'd shared. "She made me a better man." Alice reached for my hand, her fingers warm against mine. "She'd be proud of you, you know, for everything you've done, for taking care of me." Her words hit me harder than I expected, and I squeezed her hand in return. "I just did what needed to be done," I said. She shook her head. "No, you did more than that. You gave me a home when no one else would. You gave me... you..." The room fell silent, the crackling fire the only sound between us. Alice's gaze met mine, her green eyes bright and unwavering. For a moment, I felt like the years had vanished, and we were just two people sitting together, unburdened by the weight of the world. She leaned closer, her free hand brushing against my cheek. "You're everything to me, Gramps," she said softly. Her words hung in the air, and I didn't know how to respond. All I knew was that my heart was pounding, and the space between us felt impossibly small. "Alice," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. But she didn't let me finish. Instead, she leaned in, her lips brushing against my cheek in a kiss that lingered just a moment too long. "I'm glad we have each other," she said, pulling back just enough to look at me. "Me too," I replied, my voice thick with emotion. She smiled, her hand still resting against my cheek. And for the first time in years, I felt something stir within me that I couldn't quite name. The fire crackled softly in the hearth as Alice stood by the window, her silhouette framed against the pale glow of moonlight. The evening had grown quiet, the kind of silence that seemed to magnify every heartbeat, every breath. I watched her from my chair, the way her blonde hair spilled over her shoulders, catching the light in soft waves. There was something ethereal about her at that moment, poised and thoughtful, as if she carried the weight of the world in her slender frame. "Do you ever wonder," she began, her voice soft, "why things happen the way they do?" "Every day," I replied, rising to join her. "But I've learned not to question it too much. Life has a way of working itself out." She turned to me then, her green eyes searching mine. "You've always believed that, haven't you? That things happen for a reason?" I nodded, unsure of where this was going. "It's the only way to make sense of it all." She smiled faintly, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, as if compelled by some invisible force, I reached out and pulled her into a hug. She didn't resist, her body melting into mine as I wrapped my arms around her from behind. "You've always been my rock, Bobby," she whispered, the name slipping from her lips with ease. I froze for a moment, caught off guard by the sound of it. She'd never called me that before, not in all the years I'd known her. "Bobby," I repeated, my voice tinged with surprise. She tilted her head back to look at me, her expression open and sincere. "It feels right. More personal. More us." I didn't know how to respond, so I simply nodded. "If that's what you want." "It is," she said firmly, leaning her head against my chest. "You're not just my grandfather, Bobby. You're so much more than that." Her words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. I held her close, my thoughts swirling as I tried to make sense of the moment. The days that followed were a blur of quiet conversations and unspoken understanding. Alice and I fell into an unspoken rhythm, our time together marked by a newfound closeness that neither of us dared to question. She began calling me Bobby more often, the name slipping from her lips with an ease that made my heart ache. It felt intimate in a way I hadn't expected, like a bridge between the roles we'd once occupied and the connection we now shared. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, Alice turned to me with a look of quiet determination. "I've been thinking," she began, her fingers tracing idle patterns on her knee. "About what?" I asked, setting aside the book I'd been pretending to read. "About us," she said simply. Her words hung in the air, and I felt my chest tighten. "What about us?" She hesitated for a moment, her gaze fixed on the floor. "I don't want to pretend any more, Bobby. Not with you. Not about how I feel." Her confession hit me like a wave, the truth of it washing over me in a flood of emotions I wasn't ready to face. "Alice," I began, my voice faltering, but she didn't let me finish. "I know it's not normal," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "but I don't care. You're the only person who's ever made me feel this way, the only person I've ever trusted completely." I stared at her, unsure of how to respond. Her vulnerability was raw and unguarded, and it left me feeling both protective and powerless. "I don't know what to say," I admitted finally. "You don't have to say anything," she replied, reaching for my hand. "I just need to know if you feel the same." Her fingers were warm against mine, her touch steady despite the tremor in her voice. For a long moment I said nothing, my thoughts racing as I tried to make sense of the emotions coursing through me. When I finally spoke, my voice was quiet but firm. "You're everything to me, Alice. You always have been." Her eyes filled with tears, and she smiled, a small, tentative smile that spoke of hope and relief. "Then that's enough," she said softly. The weeks that followed were a study in quiet intimacy. We spent our days as we always had, sharing meals and stories. But there was an unspoken shift in the way we moved through the world together. Alice began taking over small parts of the household that Stella had once handled, her presence filling the spaces that had felt so empty after my wife's passing. She cooked dinner with a care that reminded me of Stella's quiet devotion, her laughter filling the house in a way that made it feel alive again. At night, we sat together on the couch, her head resting on my shoulder as we watched old movies. Sometimes, she would take my hand, her fingers lacing through mine in a gesture that felt both natural and profound. And though we never spoke of it, There was a sense of inevitability in the way our lives had intertwined, as if we were following a path that had always been meant for us. As we sat by the fire, Alice turned to me, her green eyes bright with conviction. "I'll always be yours, Bobby. In every way," she said softly, leaning in to kiss my cheek. A fire ignited between us, unspoken but undeniable.